What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with Reactions to the Classics, and today we got a Roy Orbison Top 10 Songs reaction brought to us by our friend, longtime supporter, and Orbison super fan, Evan David. Thank you, Evan David. Appreciate everything you do. Appreciate all the patrons who make this thing go. If you'd like to support us in any way, check out the Patreon link below or the Patreon link on the end screen. We put up videos every single day, and the patrons make this thing go. All right, I'll get into this in a little bit, but I did a Roy Orbison album reaction to Mystery Girl a year ago this month in February of 2022, as I'm in February 2023 when I'm recording this. I can just tell you before we go any further, the music won't be in this video. It'll be a Vimeo link below. So I suggest if you're going to follow along with the music, which I highly recommend, go get on there right now. But Evan David always gives fantastic background. This is no exception. So here we go. These are all Evan David's words. Rock and roll legend has it that Roy Orbison was born on the 23rd of April, 1936 in Vernon, Texas, in the midst of the mass poverty caused by the Great Depression, combined with the Dust Bowl. It was Roy's father, an oil well driller / car mechanic, who later moved his family to Fort Worth in order to find work in the wartime aircraft industry, who first sparked his son's lifelong passion for music by giving him his first guitar at age 6, with Roy declaring that he was duly finished for anything else by the age of 7. This love of music and of Hispanic blues and country music in particular would thankfully prove to be a great solace to Roy after his family moved once again to the allegedly one-horse town of Wink, Texas in 1946. Otherwise, his adolescence would doubtlessly have been distinctly miserable as someone who just didn't fit in with the typical all-American teenage environment of the time. As Roy himself later put it, quote, "There are so many ways to be lonely in West Texas. It was macho guys working in the oil fields and grease and football and all about being a stud. So I got out of there as quick as I could, and I resented having to be there. It was tough as could be, no illusions, no mysteries, no dreams in Wink. I had formed a high school band called the Wink Westerners, but we quickly changed the name to the cooler sounding Teen Kings. I didn't know what the stumbling blocks were or how likely you were to succeed at singing, but it didn't matter. I thought my voice was sort of a wonder. It was great and it didn't hurt anybody and it made me feel good. So I grabbed my group together and went on the road for 2 or 3 months. That was the beginning of my professional career. I made a demo of Ooby Dooby and sent it to Sam Phillips in Memphis, Tennessee." End quote. Ooby Dooby was duly released by Sam Phillips' Sun Records in 1956 and managed to break the Billboard Hot 100. Although this proved to be something of a false start in chart success when it only rose to number 59. Nevertheless, this was the first major stepping stone in Roy's musical career, and he soon began to develop his own songwriting skills, as well as cultivate close friendships with such sun-aligned musical notables as Johnny Cash, who had recommended that Orbison contact Sam Phillips in the first place, and most famously of all, Elvis Presley himself, who years later would allegedly remark that Roy Orbison was the best singer in the world and the only one who could out-sing him. As for how his glorious singing voice had evolved in the first place, however, according to Roy himself, quote, "I never had any formal training. I think maybe it's just that I might be a baritone with a real high range, 2.5 octaves or so, but I never checked it. I started singing this way because I was writing songs and I wrote the melody that I heard in my head, and then I had to sing those notes as well. I didn't know how high or low you were supposed to go. I had to write the songs that I wanted to sing because no one else really would at the time. Then I thought since I wrote them, I might sing them better than the next person. That big sound of mine wasn't planned. It just evolved from the freedom I had because I never took music lessons and I didn't know you should write a verse and a chorus. I just took the melody where I felt it should go. Indeed, it was above all Roy's voice which would ensure that he once again stood out from the crowd of his musical peers, even as his own career continued to take shape, eventually leaving Sun Records and signing with Frank Foster's Nashville-based Monument Records in 1960, the year which would also see him release what would soon become his first major hit, namely Only the Lonely, co-written with his new songwriting partner, Joe Melson. Only the Lonely would reach number 2 in the US and number 1 in the UK and would prove to be the definitive template for many more Orbison hits in a similar vein over the next 4 years, such as Running Scared, Crying, In Dreams, and It's Over, amidst a slew of others, all of which would seek to pack as much dramatic sentimentality and overwhelming angst as was possible into a brief span of 2 or 3 minutes tops. These masterful mini-operas would soon see Orbison be dubbed, quote, "the Caruso of rock and roll," to go alongside with his other far more endearing nickname of the Big O. And even when, as in perhaps his most famous tune, "Oh Pretty Woman," the singer would ultimately get a tentatively happy ending of sorts, he would usually have still had to go through the proverbial emotional ringer in order to get there. Orbison himself would later describe how each of my early hits is a piece of storytelling. But whether I was physically crying or just crying inside, it's the same thing. There I was talking about feelings when the whole age was macho. I've always gone against the grain. All this would be coupled with Roy's deceptively simple yet utterly compelling performance style that saw him stand almost motionless on stage while singing his anthemic tunes in his typically all-black attire, including the notorious pair of dark sunglasses, which he would wear on stage after losing his original thick glasses while on tour to ensure that almost uniquely amongst American solo artists at the time, he would be able to weather the initial storm of the British invasion and indeed would become even more enduringly popular in the UK than he was in his native land, as evidenced by the fact that once, when Orbison was first touring in the UK with the Beatles, the latter would apparently go so far as to jokingly physically restrain him from going on stage for a staggering 14th encore. Now, I know that's the lore. I don't believe anybody went on stage for 14 encores, but these stories get better, when you hear those things. And maybe it's true. I don't know. While saying, "Yankee, go home." As eyewitness Tony King, then publicist for Roy's UK record Decca, later put it, quote, "In spite of the fact that the Beatles were getting this huge acclaim from the British public, when Roy came on stage, he still had the goods to top them. He just stood there and sang. That's all he did. He didn't do anything else. I don't remember him putting one foot to the left or right. That was what the impact was. It was that he had the nerve to do that, to just stand there and let his voice do the work." Even as Roy's musical career was seemingly going so well, however, a succession of disastrous events in his personal life during the mid to late 60s, including not only the loss of his beloved first wife, Claudette, in a motorcycle accident in 1966, but the death of his two eldest sons by her in a house fire a mere 2 years later, would not only serve to arrest his existing artistic momentum, but would also lead to much idle speculation that an inexorable, if not inevitable, sense of tragedy now seemed to be indelibly attached to Roy's life, which was indeed beginning to imitate the emotional bleakness of his art. The psychological impact of these seismic personal events, as well as steadily declining sales of much of his new music, would see Roy apparently spend most of the 70s in something of a career of limbo, although it was Alex Orbison, who was Roy's second and youngest son by his second wife, Barbara, whom Roy had met shortly before the fire and had swiftly married in turn in 1969, would later point out, "People said, 'Roy, you wrote these songs, you must be this sad guy.' And it would seem like the tragedies would happen and then you'd write crying or it's over. But truthfully, my dad wrote those songs when he was in a much better place. And after the tragedies happened, that put my dad at a disconnect with his songwriting craft. In the middle of the 70s, it puts Roy alone in the middle of a world that had changed so far from what he knew. Very happy that his present family is flourishing, but outside that, everything had fallen apart. His new records didn't sell as well as his old records, but the guy literally had sold millions of his greatest hits records and was still one of the highest paid entertainers," end quote. Evan David says, indeed, even while his own recording career was still in the doldrums, Roy continued to retain much of the popularity as a touring artist, especially in the UK. And as the 70s transitioned to the 80s, a wide array of artists, including Linda Ronstadt, Don McLean, and Van Halen, began to have more and more commercial success with covers of his 60s hits, while Roy himself won a Grammy Award for his duet of That Lovin' You Feeling Again with Emmylou Harris in 1981. Perhaps the two most significant examples of the high esteem in which Roy was held by his musical peers during this period took place in 1987. However, the first of which occurred when Roy Orbison was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by Bruce Springsteen, with the boss lavishing heartfelt praise for Roy's seminal influence upon his own musical career by revealing that, quote, "In 75, we went into the studio to make Born to Run. I wanted to make a record with words like Bob Dylan. It sounded like Phil Spector, but most of all, I wanted to sing like Roy Orbison. Now, everybody knows that nobody sings like Roy Orbison." Springsteen's speech clearly helped to boost Roy's returning professional self-confidence, which was bolstered still further in turn a few months later when an all-star group of artists, including Springsteen, Elvis Costello, Tom Waits, and Katie Lang, who herself had duetted with Roy on a new version of Crying earlier in 1987, which won a Grammy in its own right following his death, served as Roy's backing band for his legendary Black and White Night concert at the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles, which was also filmed and released on video to great success. All this coupled with David Lynch's inspired use of Orbison's In Dreams for a key sequence in his groundbreaking cult movie Blue Velvet a year earlier in 1986 would see Roy's newfound cultural cachet steadily rise further and further during this time when, as Roy himself put it, quote, "It was like everyone was starting up my career without me, and my life again climbed mountains. There was some fear involved because there was a legend in the background haunting me and no way I would be able to live up to it. And then I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was jumping in with both feet and being committed. I've been taken aback by the way things are going. It's very nice to be wanted again, but I still can't quite believe it." Even as this long overdue return to artistic prominence began to gather momentum, meanwhile, Roy had already met with longtime Orbison fan Jeff Lynne at the former's new California home back in 1985. And it was this meeting which would sow the seeds of what would ultimately be Roy's final studio album, Mystery Girl. Over the next few years, Roy would continue to work alongside both Lynn and other such luminaries as Tom Petty and members of U2, amongst others, in order to craft this album, while at the same time becoming heavily involved in perhaps the most beloved and successful supergroup project of all time, in the shape of the Traveling Wilburys, which he formed with Lynn, Petty, George Harrison, and Bob Dylan. As Alex Orbison puts it, however, quote, "The Wilburys weren't the saving grace. My dad was at zero and they pulled him out. Everything in my dad's life was already working, and as a result of that, the Wilburys happened, and my dad's at top form," end quote. Unfortunately, while all this return to top form during the mid-'80s may have been both personally and artistically gratifying for Roy, the added pressures of his Wilburys commitments, on top of an increasingly busy touring and publicity schedule, would ultimately only serve to put ever more stresses and strains upon a body which had already suffered the trauma of major open heart surgery all the way back in 1978. The new album, dubbed Mystery Girl, had nevertheless been completed in November of 1988, and by early December, Roy was looking forward to visiting his surviving son from his first marriage, Wesley Orbison, back in Texas and listening to the finished album with him. Sadly, it was not to be, as Roy Orbison was to perish of a massive heart attack on December the 6th, 1988, at the far too young age of 52. The Mystery Girl album would be released posthumously on January the 31st, 1989, peaking at number 5 on the U.S. album charts and 2 in the UK, and Evan David says it remains one of his all-time favorite albums to this day. I already asked Sean to review Mystery Girl a year ago. However, I wanted to follow it up in the case of this top 10 by concentrating upon my personal favorite tunes from Roy's other most creatively and commercially successful period, namely the early to mid-'60s instead. In doing so, I've hopefully managed to give due honor to the memories of both Roy himself as well as the sadly recently deceased stalwart of the RTTC comment section and fellow Roy Orbison fan, Poet GB, who passed away in August of last year and was just a great addition to the channel and would spend hours watching our videos and commenting to everybody, and just a great guy. Evan Davis says, "I didn't know Poet all that well myself, but what I do know is that he always came across as both a kind soul and a gentleman to boot. He was both, who reliably gave insightful, detailed, and above all, affectionately constructive comments on several of my own RTTC-related videos, as well as many others, and whose unabashed musical enthusiasm is sorely missed by the entire RTTC community." I agree. As such, this Roy Orbison 60s Top 10 is finally dedicated to the memory of Poet GB, and I hope he would have enjoyed it. In the meantime, whether you agree with my choices or not, please feel free to follow his example by leaving your own Roy Orbison Top 10 list in the comments below. And finally, Evan David says, "Until then, I can best sum up why Roy Orbison himself remains so beloved by devotees, such as Poet and myself, by quoting Mystery Girl's original liner notes as follows. First, there was a voice. It transcended generations and sang of universal longings that touched the heart with truth and sadness and desire. It was a beautiful instrument that was played with something approaching perfection. It was a voice that never lied. The man was kind and good and gentle in a business and a world where such simple attributes are the exceptions. He sounded like a lost angel, but always wore dark glasses and dressed in black. He had more than his fair share of personal tragedies and suffered in his own way, and only mentioned it between the lines. Roy Orbison sang about the great mystery, the only one that matters, the mystery of love, where there is no solution, there is only hope. His songs take us into a room, and we hear the thrill and threat of the mystery in the dark, where nothing is seen and everything is revealed." All right, a reminder, I said at the start of this video, but the music will not be in this video. It'll be a Vimeo link below before we jump into this. I'll have the lyrics up as always. Thanks again, Evan David. Number 10, Crying. Evan David says, first released as a single in July of 1961, reaching number 2 on the US Billboard Hot 100 and 25 on the UK singles chart. This captivating tune was also later covered by Don McLean in 1981 and then re-recorded as what became a Grammy Award-winning duet between Katie Lang and Orbison himself in 1987. As Orbison biographer John Kruth puts it, whether or not Roy ever intended his music as therapy, his songs had a way of speaking to weary souls everywhere, the great pretenders who go through the emotions of their lives every day without speaking a word. And Crying is perhaps a prime example of this therapeutic power. As such, I'd like you to please react to the live performance of Crying on ATV's British TV special, The Roy Orbison Show, in 1964. So I will have this video up. All right, Crying, what a fantastic song, what a fantastic performance. And I don't know a ton of Roy Orbison, right? I know that a lot of the hits, I guess, and I'll probably come across some of them on here. But, just a showcase, one of the greatest showcases for his voice. And you just feel the angst and the pain inside of him. So I thought that was cool. It's funny, it's a very young Roy, yet Roy looks the same, like always, with the dark shades and the hair. Like he didn't really age. He just looked the same whenever it was. All right, next up at number 9, we got Working for the Man. Evan David says, first released as a B single to Roy's Hawaiian fable Leah in September of 1962 and reaching a relatively lowly 33 in the US in the process, although it did make it to number 1 in Australia. This double-edged saga of a downtrodden but scheming working man with a cunning plan was inspired by Roy's early negative experience as a post-high school manual labor, shoveling tar on the blazing hot Texas interstate, and has always been a personal favorite of mine, Evan David says, because of the way it captures both Roy's well-known storytelling skills as a songwriter, as well as the wry sense of humor for which he is rather less well known. All right, Working for the Man, really good tune there. I've never really heard Roy beyond the Pain songs or like Oh Pretty Woman, so it's kind of cool to hear that. And it has a nice little twist. He's just telling you how bad it sucks working there, but boss's daughter slips in some water and they're going to meet afterwards. And someday this company and that girl is going to be his. So he's going to get the last laugh. Roy has a plan. So a cool one there. All right, next up at number 8, we have Too Soon to Know. Evan David says, first released as a single in August 1966, reaching 68 in the US, but number 3 in the UK. In the latter case, despite being temporarily banned by the BBC due to the sensitivity of its subject, given the tragic death of Roy's first wife, Claudette, in a motorcycle accident in June of that year. This overwhelmingly bleak ode to just how impossibly difficult it can be, or at least seems to be, to recover from a lost love, was in fact recorded before the deadly crash, and in any case was not in fact written by Roy himself, but was instead part of an album of Don Gibson covers. Nevertheless, for me, Evan David says, the raw emotion in the song itself loses not one iota of its power and poignancy as a result of this additional context. Too Soon to Know, much slower delivery, more of what I know Roy for compared to the last song. Lyrically, I can see why maybe the BBC didn't think this was appropriate to play at the time. Although, I mean, it's just this knowing that what happened with his wife, it just makes it that much more powerful, right? That it's over. He doesn't know if he can get over. Like you could totally see how people would think he wrote this about what happened. So really powerful song there. We're up to number 7. We got Blue Angel, first released as a single in August of 1960, reaching 9 in the US and 11 in the UK. This lushly atmospheric tune serves as a calming, soothing musical balm compared to some of the more traumatized tunes for which Roy is usually infamous for. And for me, at least, Evan David says, is none the worse for that. For as John Cruth puts it, Blue Angel, quote, offered no haunted portraits or psychologically disturbed characters or dark tales of unrequited love. Instead, its power lay in its simple but insidious melody. All right. Blue Angel, Roy still showing off those musical chops, right? Those vocal chops, man. And this is definitely like a 50s song with the shabab, you know, all those different, you know, kind of vocal runnings in there. And the song is actually, Roy's not the one hurt, right? He's the one getting this girl in the rebound. He's like, don't worry about that guy. I'm going to be here. So I thought that was a nice tune. Next up at number 6, we have Running Scared. First released as a single in March of 1961, reaching 1 in the US and 9 in the UK. According to Roy's fellow traveling wheelbarrow, Jeff Lynne, quote, Roy actually told me that Running Scared was his favorite one that he ever did. It's a wonderful masterpiece of a tune. It's marvelous. It's like a miniature opera and simplicity itself, end quote. Indeed, this twisting, turning saga of a seemingly doomed love affair on the run was inspired by Ravel's Bolero and possesses a sheer operatic vocal power of its own that makes it very tough to beat, even by Roy's own lofty standards on that score. A power whose capture was oddly enough made possible by the sublimely simple studio trick of placing a laden coat rack between Roy and his band so that the latter sound wouldn't bleed into Roy's microphone while he was reaching this tune's senses-shattering final notes. Running Scared, you could tell with the orchestra there and everything. I don't usually add anything to Evan David's research because there's so much of it, but here's a cool thing about the song. It was allegedly written in 5 minutes. He improved his vocal technique in an effort to please producer Fred Foster. Here's what Roy said about it. He said on Running Scared, the song, most of the high notes are falsetto. We had 30 musicians and Fred Foster said, how come I can't hear the ending? We're going to lose the record if you can't give me a little more. He said, run it by one more time, and I did it in full voice. I didn't even know I could do that at the time. I didn't know there was a difference between full voice and falsetto. I could feel the difference, but I didn't understand the technical differences. Then the power of the voice came. It was a gradual thing, and it came with confidence. I thought that was a good quote. And basically in this one, he's running scared. Some of us have been in this situation. He's with this girl, he loves her, but he knows she's still in love with her ex, and he's running scared that every day this ex is going to come back, and if he does, who is she going to choose? We're already to the top 5. Next up, you see Blue Bayou. First released as a single in 1963 and reaching 29 in the US, but 3 in the UK. This longing ode to a wistfully peaceful, bygone, backwards paradise was famously covered by Linda Ronstadt in 1977, which we actually have a reaction to the Linda Ronstadt one up on the channel. With the chart success of her version, which itself reached number 3 in the US, serving to spark new life into the doldrums into which Roy's own career had fallen by that point, eventually paving the way for his triumphant resurgence a decade later with the Wilburys and Mystery Girl. Nevertheless, it is Roy's original version that has long been one of my personal favorites, not least because such a song of, to quote John Carruth once again, pure longing for places he'd never seen and could only imagine in his dreams, like something akin to a mystical vision. Evan David said, it reminds me very much of some very similar concepts from the Welsh culture to which I myself belong. Blue Bayou, cool to hear that song because I had not heard Roy's version before somehow, but really good song there, shows off his power. And basically the story of the song is he's left his girl there on Blue Bayou. He's working hard. He's going to get back to her, and then his life's going to be great. Let's hope it's not like the last song where somebody comes and takes her, right? But hey, good song there. Really showed off the voice and the control of the voice. All right, next up at number 4 on Evan David's Roy Orbison Top 10 Songs, we got Only the Lonely. Evan David says, first released as a single in May 1960, reaching number 2 in the US and 1 in the UK. This beautiful loner's anthem was first offered to both the Everly Brothers and Elvis before Roy finally elected to record it himself, finally kickstarting his own previously stalled chart career in the process. Whether or not it was Roy or his co-writer Joe Melson who first came up with the tune's evocative title remains a matter of some dispute, but what cannot be disputed is the fact that, as Melson himself once put it, quote, that song went straight to the top and put Roy on the road performing because it was just such a nailer of a song. The crowd loved it. They wanted to see him, end quote. Indeed, at least one of those who first heard the song back in those early days, namely Jeff Lynne, describes it as something of an unforgettable experience, stating that, quote, Only the Lonely, I suppose, is the first one of those things when I was real young that I heard and thought, my God, how does that happen? What is that? How does it work? How do all these people know what they're doing? Seems like hundreds in the studio. Obviously, it doesn't sound that big now, but it still sounds pretty big, I tell you. Only the Lonely, definitely bridging that gap from the late 50s to the early 60s, right? It definitely has that call and response and the harmonies in there from the backing vocals. But, you know, he's I don't know if he's left by this girl or he never was really with her, but he was in love with her. But later on, he hopes a new romance is going to come because only the lonely can really understand and empathize with him. And I think we've all been there, Roy. So really good vocal showcase there. All right, we got 3 songs left. Number 3, In Dreams. First released as a single in February 1963, reaching 7 in the US, 6 in the UK. This gloriously evocative yet still bittersweet ode to the fleeting joys of slumberland first came to Orbison appropriately enough while he was still half asleep, with Roy himself claiming, quote, that my thoughts were still racing when that whole introduction just came to me. I thought, boy, that's good. I need to finish that. Too bad these things don't happen in my dreams. I woke up the next morning. 20 minutes later, I had the whole song written. Moreover, according to no less an authority than U2's Bono, the unorthodox song structure of In Dreams, whose melody apparently unfolds without any repeating sections, helps to make it, quote, probably the greatest pop song ever written, Bono said. High praise indeed, Evan David says. In my view, perhaps not far off. You decide. In Dreams, the recurring theme of in his dreams, the girl's with him and they're together and they're happy. But as things play out, that is not the case, and that he has to wake up. So, and remember, this was the one that was used in Blue Velvet, David Lynch's Blue Velvet. So that helped a little resurgence of this one. But felt the power, like the orchestration in there. Good tune. At number 2, we have It's Over. First released as a single in 1964, reaching number 9 in the US and number 1 in the UK. Boy, he really did hit bigger in the UK, huh? Almost every one of these. Orbison biographer Adam Clayson describes this apocalyptically operatic powerhouse of a tune as, quote, the embodiment of Roy's oft-quoted remark about packing as much poetry and philosophy into a 2-minute single as possible. A suicide note set to music and the bleak apotheosis of the running scared tension building blueprint. It's over like its subject stood alone. What a quote. It's over. Keeping with the sad theme, right? The girl tells him it's over. And so he's just crushed by this. She was untrue, though. So she was the one that caused it to happen. But tender nights before they fly, send falling stars that seem to cry, your baby doesn't want you anymore. It's over. Breaks your heart in two to know she's been untrue. But oh, what will you do? Then she said to you, there's someone new. We're through. It's over. It's not only over, but she's already replaced him. So another good showcase of his voice, of course, but also the backing orchestra and the build there is fantastic. So now we're up to number 1. Probably not a lot of mystery of what it was. You see it below, Oh Pretty Woman. Evan David says, well, what else could it be? Yes, by far Roy's most popular and well-known, and for darn good reason. This ravishingly rocking tribute to the for once maybe not quite so fatal femme of its title was released as a single in August '64, quickly reached #1 on both sides of the Atlantic. According to Roy himself, the song was conceived in the midst of a songwriting session with his co-writer Bill Dees when, quote, my wife Claudette wanted to go to town to get something. I said, do you have any money? And Bill Dees said, Pretty Woman never needs any money. Then he said, would that make a great song title? I said, no, but Pretty Woman would. So I started playing the guitar and he was slapping the table for drums. And by the time she got back, which was about 40 minutes later, we had the song. Evan David says, possessing one of the most infectious opening guitar riffs of all time, in my view, as well as a gleefully lecherous mid-song growl inspired by Bob Hope. This tune was notably covered by Van Halen in 1982, and a few years later was also used as the title of a highly successful film starring Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. Pretty good movie, kind of holds up. Fitting tributes to the irresistible appeal of what lifelong Orbison fan Bruce Springsteen once dubbed the best girl-watching rock and roll song ever. Evan David says, as such, it's perhaps fitting and I'd like you to please react to this extended live performance of Oh Pretty Woman at that 1987 star-studded Black and White Night tribute concert, in which Springsteen in particular seems to be having the time of his life playing alongside his hero, the legendary Big O. All right, Oh Pretty Woman, really cool to see that live. Just seeing the instrumental run with all those guys up there, the Luminaires, there's a lot of other famous guys there. I'll kind of leave it alone. But Billy Idol in the audience, even, I don't know what was going on there. But just fantastic, really cool. And obviously his most famous song, and the song that I think everybody almost knows that knows any music, knows that song, even if they don't even know who Roy is. So a fitting choice at #1. And that's going to take me to my favorite tracks. But before that, Evan David's got his usual long list of honorable mentions. He divided them into 2 sections. Also from the 60s, I Can't Stop Loving You, Dream Baby, Candyman, I'd Be a Legend in My Time, The Great Pretender, Love Hurts, Lana, The Crowd, All I Have to Do Is Dream, Let's Make a Memory, Falling, Pretty Paper, Born on the Wind, Right Away, Claudette, and Walk On. Plus Roy's post-60s triumphs, That Loving You Feeling Again with Emmylou Harris, Wild Hearts, Run Out of Time, I Drove All Night, Lori, and of course the entirety of the Mystery Girl album to boot. All right, so my favorites. Honorable mentions are going to be Working for the Man, Running Scared, and Only the Lonely. And my faves are going to be Crying, the first song that was on this list, and Oh Pretty Woman, the last one. But really good list here. Enjoyed a lot of songs I didn't know. Let me know what you guys thought of this list down below. What are your favorites? Give your top 10 list or top 5 or whatever if you want. Once again, thank you to Evan David. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Until next time, I will see you.